This session is going to be a slightly progresses on what we've talked about this morning. Just by way of sort of roadmap, we started with a broad vision of what transformations could be like, what transformations are like, the big questions in relation to transformation. The last session, we went into sort of more historical analysis, also looking at the future, but in three particular areas: public health, population, and energy, and looked at particular transitions that are either happening or have happened as a way of starting to sort of put some grounding into that. And now we want to look at triggers of transformations, or at least that's sort of the broad question that we started with. Cutler is back, so I'm assuming he's going to assume chair of this session. But while he's doing that, I will invite our first speaker, who is going to present on his own behalf and also on behalf of Inge Kohl, and that is Pedro, and he's going to talk about shifting private-public involvement, a public goods perspective. All yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adil. In fact, let me start by saying that I'm in a similar position to the one that you were in this morning. Because Inge Kohl, who heads our office, the Office of Development Studies at UNDP, was supposed to be here doing this presentation. And she was keenly interested and was looking forward very much to being here. For those of you that don't know about her, she was one of the founders of the Human Development Report Office at UNDP, and one of the people that introduced the concept of human development. So you can understand how interested she was in being here. Unfortunately, she was not able to come, so she asked me to present on her behalf, although I did work a little bit with her on this presentation. What we thought we would do, essentially what we would like to share with you, is some of the work that we've been doing around the idea or the concept of global public goods. And the anchor of the approach we are going to share with you here is the shifting involvements between public and private. And we thought this would be a good way to convey to you how the concept of global public goods can be useful as a conceptual tool to understand better reality, and also as that tool to mobilize policy action as well. So the presentation is structured in three parts, and I'll try to be quite brief as possible, actually. And first, I'll try to speak a little bit about this idea of shifting involvements between public and private. Secondly, I'll introduce the concept of public goods and also of global public goods. And finally, I'll try to show how this concept, this approach, can be useful to provide suggestions for enhanced policy making. Now, this term expression, shifting involvements between public and private, comes actually from a book that was published in the early 80s, I believe, by Hirschman. And his point was essentially to say that societies tend to shift between being concerned with public issues and reverting in other times towards more private individual concerns. So a way to represent this idea is to say that over time societies shift between public and private. As I mentioned, the book was written in the early 80s. And although Hirschman was speaking mostly about the way people, for example, demonstrate and engage in social causes or retreat and think more about individual and their own private interests, we followed the literature after that. And what we found was that this idea of shifting involvements between public and private was mostly described or reformulated as shifting involvements between state and market. And essentially, people acknowledge for the most part that there is really a dynamic going back and forth between state and market. But there's also a trend or a bias towards more market and less state, or more market and less government, if you will. What we suggest here is that rather than looking at shifting involvements between public and private from this perspective, which dominates the literature to a large extent, it's useful to consider the concept of public goods and to look at how the balance between public goods and private goods is reflected or is a manifestation of the shifting involvements between public and private. And our main point here is to say we spoke a lot about well-being and what defines well-being. And our main contention is that well-being depends on the consumption of private goods and also on the consumption of public goods. So private goods being food, clothing, shelter, all of the things that we derive utility, but also we derive utility, positive utility, from the consumption of public goods, having peace and security, living in a healthy environment, and so forth. So we sort of reinterpret this idea of shifting involvements between public and private with this idea of a balance between public goods and private goods. And what this could perhaps indicate the importance for the well-being of people of private goods and public goods. And so there is again this oscillation. And interestingly, what we think is that the trend moves, in this case, upwards towards the fact that public goods are, in a sense, more and more important to our well-being increasingly, we think, we find. I'll give you some examples. For example, no matter how rich we are individually and how much money we have and the ability to buy private goods we have, our security, the security environment in which we live, is threatened by international terrorism, for example. So there is something out there in the public that threatens our well-being that we cannot protect against buying private goods individually. Or health, the examples that we've discussed, SARS, West Nile encephalitis, and others. Whether it's reality or perception, the fact of the matter is that we feel that our well-being, we can take all the vaccines, do all the medical checkups, but we feel that there are things in the public domain that we really don't control and have an influence on our well-being. And I could go on and on. Now, these examples I've given are actually examples of bads, not goods. And a point that we make is that for us, public goods do not imply a value judgment or a moral judgment. We are actually thinking about things or conditions that are in the public domain. And as I mentioned in the second part of the presentation, I'll clarify more what our understanding of public goods is. But this is to give you a sense of why we think that for our own well-being, there is, of course, this oscillation between how private and public goods are important for our well-being, but we feel that public goods are increasingly bearing more importance on our well-being than private goods. So public goods are important, but as I mentioned, we can derive both positive or negative utility from public goods. And what this graph shows is that we are probably going towards having more public goods, things in the public domain, from which we derive negative utility than positive utility. Why is that? This has to do, we think, to a large extent with this idea of the planetary transition, I think it was called early this morning, or globalization, or the increasing interdependence, whatever we'd like to call it. We like to use the expression interlocking public domains, in the sense that the well-being of individuals, countries, cannot be safeguarded alone by our own private actions, or even by the actions of governments. And there are a lot of negative things out there in the public domain, which have this international or transnational nature to which we have to be attentive to. And so the ideal curve, so to speak, the ideal snake, we think, would be something that probably does not have a trend and the oscillations are not very high, and really moves towards a balance between public goods and private goods. So this is what we'd like to achieve. How could we get there? Well, we think that to get there, we really have to understand and change our policy making in order to enhance the provision of public goods, and especially global public goods. And traditionally, you know that public goods are seen as what governments do. But if we think about global public goods where there is not an international government, then the question becomes much more complex. And so how to provide global public goods, the policy changes that need to be made to enhance the provision of global public goods are really the final outcome of where we want to go with this presentation. But before I get there, let me just move to the second part and tell you how we understand what public goods are. And it may seem like just losing time talking about the definition of public goods, because, as you probably know, there is a standard definition in economics of what public goods are as being non-rival, non-excludable goods, and non-excludable in the sense that it's impossible to preclude any person from consuming the good. Non-rivalry, the fact that the reality that if I consume it, others can consume it in exactly the same proportion. Now, this is true. We don't say that this is not the case. And in fact, the first point that you see there is that, in fact, in many cases, public goods are public. And we say, as I had mentioned, that these are things and conditions that are out in the public domain, because technically, given their inherent characteristics, it's impossible to exclude others from being affected by them. But what we think we are bringing as a new perspective is to suggest that they can also be made public by design. Sometimes there is nothing inherently in the characteristics of some goods, some things, conditions, that makes them public. But there is a deliberate or not policy choice to make them public. For example, things that are made public by design, we can think about basic education in many countries or basic healthcare, things that are put out in the public domain by policy design, or by policy choices that are not deliberate, sometimes because we just don't know that we are putting things out in the public domain. We are neglectful. And the environment is full of examples in this area. CFCs for many years were being put out in the public domain, and we probably didn't know that they were harmful, for example. So the main message of our definition is merely to suggest that beyond the traditional one that suggests that public goods are related with the inherent characteristics of the goods, there is a second dimension, which is this idea that there is also policy choice involved in many cases. Now, global public goods are just public goods that have transborder nature, that affect more than one country and often also affect more than one generation. So this is essential, our understanding of public goods and global public goods. How do we go about providing them, which is the fundamental question, and now the third part of the presentation, the final one, that deals with the policy-making implications. If you think that to provide that the nature of public goods, at least some public goods, has to do with policy choices, then the first question one has to ask is who makes those choices? Who makes those choices? Who makes the decisions on what to put in the public domain? And then there is a second question, which is, let's assume that the choice has been made. How do we go about actually producing them, bringing the goods together? Especially, again, in the case of global public goods, where you cannot say, well, let the government do it, because there is not an international or global government. So we thought that to enhance the provision of global public goods, one really has to think about these two questions and to divide the provision process into two dimensions. One that is a more political one, and it has to do with the choices that are made, and a second dimension that is more technical one, and it has to do with the production side. So the provision of global public goods has a political and then a technical or production side to it. And in the book that we've just published, we go into detail about several policy implications, but here I would just like to highlight a few. On the politics side, what we found was that it was useful to extend the subsidiarity principle or the equivalence principle of public finance to the global world or to the international context. This principle merely states that the level of decision-making should be made by those that are affected by the decisions. So if a decision has to do with the local level, a traffic sign, for example, then the local community should make the decision. If it is something that affects an entire country, then the federal government in the US should make those decisions. We think that these principles should be extended. And so we talk about this idea of matching the circles of stakeholders and the circles of decision makers. This is just an illustration. If we think about the decisions that are made concerning financial stability, for example, the Financial Stability Forum, the red dot, is a very important entity making these type of decisions, and it involves 40 members from countries, international financial institutions, and others. But they affect virtually all countries, private sector, firms, public at large. So there is a mismatch between the circle of stakeholders and the circle of decision makers. So one of the recommendations we make is that it's important to break this mismatch and try to match the two circles. So this has to do with the political side. Now, going to the production side, what we thought is useful, this has to do more with the technical dimension of the provision process, is to think about what is needed to actually produce a specific good. And what we were able to do is create these production paths for a specific global public good, for several global public goods. So there we have the example of food safety up there on top. And then we went and tried to identify all the elements that need to be brought together to produce this final global public good. I'm not going to go into details. Let me just mention that we found that there are international building blocks, international regimes, international regulations, but there are also national and regional building blocks. So the production process is a multi-level one. And also what we found was that several actors need to or have a bearing in the production of this global public good. Private individuals, households, governments, firms, civil society at large, all need to be engaged together to provide the components that are needed to come to the final global public good. So when we look at the production side, one message is that it's a multi-level process, and the second message is at the multi-actor world. So these are just to summarize some of the policy recommendations we provide in terms of how to enhance the provision of global public goods. And we believe that if these two guidelines on the politics and the production side are followed, then we could probably come to a less to an oscillation with less amplitude and less trends towards what is bad and a more balanced one. I would stop here just to let you know that the Red Book is the last one that we've published. It just came out early this year. I brought some executive summaries with me, which I will distribute. And please let me know if you'd like to have more information on it. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, we're happy to have another Boston-based colleague interested in these issues. Tariq Manouri is the Senior Research Director at the TELUS Institute, and he has wide-ranging interests. Most recently, I can't these things move, it's glued to the screen here. On issues broadly related to sustainable development policy, and has done a lot of work over the years that I've followed with great interest in the areas of climate change, conservation strategy development, governance, and institutional development for the environment. He has a lot of experience in Pakistan and policy development through a lot of a combination of research and analysis and a lot of sort of on-the-ground stakeholder participation work. So without further ado, Tariq.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, let me thank the organizers and our chair, who's also one of the organizers, for inviting me here. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so we can leave this up in case people get bored of looking at my face. what I want to do, not only, this is deliberate. I deliberately did not want to have a PowerPoint presentation, partly because I wanted to, go, it sort of has made me intellectually very lazy. You put things up and, you sort of don't have that sort of gut feeling about it. So I wanted to get back recover that feeling. What I want to do is slightly different, perhaps, from the way in which the conversation have been running this morning, mainly to ask the following question. How do we think about how would change be engendered? How to think about how change would be engendered? In some sense, getting behind the larger issue of not only the drivers, but how would we think about the drivers? Partly to change the focus from data to narrative, and partly, of course, also, there is a particular view. There's a wonderful phrase by Hans-Georg Gaudemer who says that every point of view has to be a point of view. So in some sense, I'm trying to say, well, here is a place that I come from, and I want to talk a little bit about that place, partly to give you a little metaphor, and then to tease out a little bit of the implications of this. The metaphor is in the title itself, and I want to sort of develop it a little bit further, just to see if we can, we can see what are the implications of looking at things this way. But it goes back a little bit of the ways. I remember when I was at Rio as part of an NGO delegation, and also sitting in on some of the governmental work, looking at the Rio process and trying to make sense of it. Ended up writing an article which sort of, very untransparently I entitled The Ark and the Cross, Noah's Ark and Jesus' Cross, mainly to say that there are two completely different sensibilities confronting each other when we sort of engaged in Rio. And one is the sort of the northern sensibility about, here is a problem and we have to deal with it, and, here are some of the ways in which we can deal with it. And there was a southern sensibility as well, which sort of said, well, what is behind this? What is going to happen to us? How are we going to deal with the way in which this global community is going to be dealing with this? And I tried to use the ark and the cross metaphor to say that there's one sensibility which says, here is Noah building his ark to save humanity from the deluge. And there's another sensibility which says, here is Jesus, or the South, being crucified for the sins of humanity. And all you see when you look at Rio is somebody sawing a log of wood, and you don't know whether it's going to carry Noah's body or Jesus' body, and your reactions are completely different depending on which one of these things you see. Now, in a sense, that metaphor, in some sense has kind of muted, but in some sense has become a little bit more potent. And I want to take us in the direction of where I think it has actually become, let's say, more relevant and more potent, how the South actually looks at some of these things. Let me start at the beginning. I'm going to use a number of metaphors. Paul this morning introduced this idea of the planetary phase of civilization. Now, I actually prefer that phrase to globalization, because it actually places agency at the center. It treats it as a kind of a transitive rather than intransitive. It's not just something that is happening, but it's a phase of civilization. It's we humans who are creating it, or to use the words, the future is not where we are going, it's something that we are creating. Now, as we think of the planetary phase of civilization, as we collectivity as a human being, the question comes back, a question that has haunted us from almost the time that we began to think about moral philosophy, and that is, how are we to think of ourselves as a collectivity? How are we to think of ourselves as a collectivity? One book which has influenced my thinking greatly in this regard is Benedict Anderson's very rightly regarded textbook, somewhere in the mid-1980s, called Imagined Communities. Anderson was talking about the rise of the nation state, and he was talking about, how does it happen that these people who don't even know each other suddenly begin to think of themselves as a community, So person A is willing to kill person B over a piece of land that nobody has any proximity to. And they feel completely justified that they're part of this community. And he's sort of, talking about this. Now, in some sense, when we think of the nation state, we used to think of it as an imagined community and how it has evolved and so forth. Now, I mean, one way of thinking about the planetary phase of civilization is that all of us today, people in this room, and you know, a very large number of people, is engaged in the process of actually thinking through, working out the dimensions of this global identity, this imagined global community. You know, making very, very constructive the global identity. Now, Ben Anderson has a number of very, very important things to say about this. Many of them don't need to detain us, but a couple of things I'm going to bring back to you. One very interesting thing, which I might sort of mention almost in parenthesis, he said, you know, this imagined communities that we talk about, I mean, you know, when you think of a human, you know, you start with birth and we end with death. And he said the community, it generally starts with death. You know, I mean, there is some martyr or somebody who dies, and, you know, after that, the Scots become a nation, or, you know, somebody sort of, you know, big people begin to think of their eponymous ancestor, and that they sort of feel that this is an identity, and this identity makes some meaning for them. The reason I'm saying it is that it is quite possible that history will look back at September the 11th, and rather than to think of the internet, and rather than to think of all the things that happened before Rio and Johannesburg and this, that, and Johannesburg happened later, but some of the other things, but to look at September the 11th as kind of, you know, the global period, and for reasons that we will see when we get back to it. But one of the things that we are sort of seeing is sort of a coalescing around a global identity, around a sort of global sense, and the question we need to ask is how are we to think about this, particularly how are we to think about this as in the terms of shaping the future that we are interested in shaping. A second interesting thing, which perhaps, you know, I am perhaps more idiosyncratically reading into it, perhaps related to the concept of death, is this notion of hubris. I feel that, I mean, hubris, of course, is particularly evident in today's world. You know, as you know, it's almost impossible to hear anybody talk about globalization without this feeling almost of, you know, this tremendous uniqueness. I mean, this is almost like a chosen generation. You know, we are at the threshold of a new era. We are at the cusp of this thing. I mean, you know, you look at the literature. I mean, major things happened in the 20th century. But I think this feeling of this being a very, very special time is perhaps far more pronounced today than perhaps in the 80s and the 70s and so on. I can think of the speeches and the writings that took place, for instance, in my country, Pakistan, and India, and countries in that area became independent. You know, Nehru's tryst with destiny, and, you know, the sense that we were a chosen generation at that time was very palpable and very strong. But suddenly, for a number of reasons, we are feeling that there is a kind of a hubris, and without meaning to use that pun, there's a kind of a millenarianism. Wolfgang Sachs, of course, whom Adil quoted this morning, he connects it to the picture of the globe, and he said, you know, this is the first generation that has actually seen the Earth from outside, and I think that actually gives us a tremendous sense of power and sense of almost pride, and he says arrogance, you know, in terms of thinking about the world, but also this sense of responsibility of shaping the world. In any event, what I want to do is to push Benedict Anderson's metaphor a little bit, and try to ask the dimensions of us creating this imagined global identity. How do we think about this? I'm going, of course, to make the point that the best way to think about it as if we were thinking in the context of a developing country. But before I do that, I want to make one other point. The philosopher Ortega y Gasset made an interesting point in some of his writings, and perhaps it's useful to. I feel a little bit compelled by it, although, and you know, feel free to challenge me on this thing. I mean, I'm not sure how committed I am to it, but I mean, he basically has this idea that the collectivity is like an animal. You know, he thinks that humans sort of tend to create this distance between reason and nature and culture, between sort of the natural part and between the rational, the mental part. And we tend to extrapolate our sense of ourselves as individuals into the collectivity. But the collectivity actually operates much more by instinct, and, you know, much more by sort of a collective drives, as it were. And the whole history of civilization, you can see, as sort of a means of shaping taming the instincts of the collectivity. Not so much the individual, but of the collectivity, to make the collectivity sort of work together in a way. And it could be that one can say it's taming of capitalism, but capitalism is also a way of sort of the way in which the collectivity expresses itself. And at various points in time, this animal escapes from the cage that we have built around it. And so in some sense, we can say that there is a uniqueness at this point because the animal has escaped yet again. Capitalism, or the forces which sort of drive our society, we felt in the 20th century that notwithstanding all the violence that took place, that we had sort of placed it in a cage and we were well in control, and all of a sudden it's out again, and we are not really sure which way it is going, and therefore it's incumbent upon us to come back and retame it. So in some sense, the idea of the shaping of the global identity is also a shaping of the global collectivity, the taming of the global collectivity. You get it back into its cage, let it serve us rather than to eat us. Now, let me sort of make my central thesis. My central thesis is that when we think about this global collectivity, the 6.5 billion people who now populate the globe, think of it as a country, as a single country, not as a single government, but think of it as a country. The moment you start thinking about a country, it becomes immediately obvious that it has all the characteristics that we associate with what we call a third world or a developing country. In fact, not even a developing country, but a country which is in some sense, in a tremendous sense of crisis. Sakiko yesterday referred to some of the poverty statistics. I think they're very compelling, and this morning I also referred to them. In 1989, when Mahbub al-Haq wrote the first Human Development Report, what he said is that the population income distribution, where he made the famous champagne glass, the richest 20% have 83.7% of the income, and the poorest 20% have 1.4% of the income, a ratio of 1:60. And in the Millennium process, the Secretary General's report to the Millennium Summit, they went back to 1950, where they said the ratio was 1:30, and by the year 2000, the ratio was 1:80. And in some sense, in 50 years, when world income grew by 5-fold, world trade grew more than 12-fold. The tremendous power and success of this thing that we call globalization was the same time at which this tremendous increase in inequality took place. An increase in inequality which is, I must tell you, unimaginable in any country in the world. In fact, when you look at the statistics of any single country, you don't find significant changes. Most of the countries you find, you look at income distribution in 1960, you look at them in 2000, there are marginal changes here and there. There's some periods in which, there's some sort of rapid changes take place, but they're also, 1 or 2 percentage point. I mean, this kind of significant change has not happened. But what I want to do is to make 2 points here. One is that the world is more unequal than the most unequal of countries in the world. Brazil was oftentimes said to be the most unequal country in the world. The world as a whole is even more unequal than Brazil. It is the most unequal country in the world. Secondly, not only is it unequal, it is becoming even more unequal. It is becoming even more unequal, and that actually signifies the absence of some kind of a political community which would respond to issues of justice and fairness and equity and so on. So there's a fundamental problem. Second problem, dualism. When you look at the world as a country, we economists used to call dualism, we used to refer to development as this process of overcoming dualism. You had a modern sector and you had a traditional sector. The traditional sector was biomass-based and poor and excluded and so on and so forth. And the modern sector was connected to the global economy, corporatized, formal, et cetera, very dynamic sector and so forth. Now, in most of the rich countries, you actually don't find that kind of dualism. Even if it is, it's very muted, and in some sense, one has to stretch oneself in order to discover it. Many developing countries, the vast majority of them, particularly in Africa and Asia, and Latin America for that matter, you still find, this extent of dualism. You leave the city, you go out 20 miles, and you're in a completely different world. I mean, it's almost as if the world did not exist. 120 years after the invention of electricity, vast majorities of people in Africa and Asia, in South Asia and Africa, do not have access to reliable and continuous energy sources of the type that Cutler was mentioning this morning. So C.K. Prahalad, the management scientist, he constructs this pyramid in which he looks at how production is organized in the world. And basically what he says is that 70% of resources are actually used by the organized sector. But the vast majority of the outputs that they produce are really for the top of the pyramid, something like the top 10% of the world's population. And when you go to the bottom 40% of the world's population, and you look at what centuries of technological progress have given them, well, I mean, the bicycle and a sewing machine, maybe a transistor radio, and that's about it. When I go to villages in my country, I mean, that's about the extent of what technology. Now, of course, there are the little Suzukis, these little, very small cars and trucks which sort of do that. So there is that. Plus, of course, there is the green revolution, which I think is a major exception to what I've been saying. But there is a kind of a dualism. Now, if you think of the world as one country, you don't think of it like Switzerland. It is a dualistic country. It is a country with those two very different economic systems. It's also a country with two very different political systems. I mean, in my country, we often say that people talk about governance, but these people talk about it in Islamabad, the capital. The problem of governance is not in Islamabad. It is in that village out there between the landlord and the peasant and people who control water and people who control land. And nobody really understands what to do about governance in those contexts. Well, at the global level also, we have the same kind of a situation. The global country is almost like Afghanistan. The writ of the powerful runs in the metropolis. And in Afghanistan, it is Kabul. Here, it is North America, Europe, and a few of the capitals around the world. You get out there, and you're in no man's land. I mean, there is a political dualism. There's also a cultural dualism of sorts. There is a lingua franca. I mean, I travel around the world because I understand English, and I can speak English. I find myself a part of this global community. But my cousin, who unfortunately did not go to school or did not, get enough years of schooling, is almost more or less excluded, and they're, just as in my country, we live in these two communities with, two very different prospects and two very different ways of understanding and communicating. For me, I mean, it's really a cultural divide even within my country. I mean, for me, the French Revolution is a real fact, and for him, the French Revolution might as well not exist because it's not part really of their cultural sort of makeup. I laugh at Woody Allen movies. My cousin would actually be quite surprised about, how can anybody find this funny, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a cultural divide. So what I'm saying is that when one thinks at the global level and you think of it as a country, think of it as a single country. It's not the kind of homogeneous countries that we tend to think about. There are a number of other things, on which I'll quickly one is that this world as a country is an apartheid country. It's an apartheid country. In South Africa, the black people in Soweto had to carry papers, were allowed to come into the white areas only at sufferance, for little periods of time, had to go back and so forth, were humiliated by the police every time they stopped them and so on and so forth. Well, that still happens to me when I come into the United States or I come into Europe, and less so to me, of course, than to many of my other compatriots. Whatever the reasons, and of course the South Africans justified it because of the crime and other things, and so also it is justified today. There is warlordism. It's not a country with a single government. I mean, every different warlords run their own fiefs, and then there's some kind of an unequal power relationship between them, and sometimes you can pressure them, sometimes you don't, and so on. It's also a conflict civilization situation. There is also one word which I want to introduce to you, which is one of my very dear friends, Amir Mufti at UCLA. He was a student of Edward Said's. He introduced this notion called minoritization. Minoritization. What he means by it is that we have actually gotten into a political system in which some people become minorities. And the question really is, how are they willing to accept their role as minorities, or will they resist it? And a lot of the political movement, political changes you actually see as a way of the trajectory of minoritization. Am I willing to accept this role as a minority? I mean, minority being excluded. Obviously, many of us are quite happy to accept that role, but some of us are not happy to accept that role, and that tension exists. Now, there is very clearly a very explicit minoritization in some countries, and the global level is very obvious. Now, the main point I'm going to summarize this one is that, when you think about world and the potential for changes in the world, in the planetary society, it is better to think of it as if you were living in a third world country. Don't think of it as if trying to bring about change in Norway or United States or Switzerland or one of the rich countries. Now, let's say what happens. Now, I'm going to make the second, and there's a kind of a concluding point. What is the experience of the South? How does the collectivity, building the collectivity, how do we make sense of it? Ben Anderson, to which I will now return, makes a very important distinction between what he calls popular nationalism and official nationalism. Popular nationalism, he says, is a kind of a creation of a collective identity, a collectivity, through processes which are, in some sense, popular processes. Some of them are economic processes, some of them are intellectual processes. The printing press, to which he gives pride of place. He says the rise of the nation state had a lot to do with the printing press. It took text out of the hands of the elite. It made it widely accessible. It proletarianized language almost. Because you had dialects changing. It sort of unified language. You had dialects changing every few miles. It sort of created comprehensibility between people. It also, Latin and so forth, which were exclusive languages of the elite, more or less went out of disfavor, and essentially the the languages that people were using in their everyday life became the elite language as well. And so there's a whole range of things that the printing press did. Of course, the creation of the trade surplus and trade, the movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. Now, all of these we find parallels today. For the printing press, we have the internet. For the trade, of course, we have the massive growth in international trade. For the rural-urban migration, we have cross-country migration. We are thinking at global levels the kind of processes that Ben Anderson was talking about in the 15th to the 20th, 19th centuries, the process that shaped the nation state. As opposed to it, he called something official nationalism, a nationalism that is actually created by design. And there he focuses on three things: census, map, museum. Census, put people in categories. And, there's an interesting sequel to this, how it sort of divides people. My friend Ashish Nandi, actually, in India, makes a very telling point that in 1941 in India, this might blow your mind if you haven't heard this before. In 1941 in India, there was a group of approximately somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people who defined themselves as, you're not going to believe it, Muslim Hindus. More than 100,000 people, Muslim Hindus. Now, after 1947, when, there was this massacres in which people killed each other, the 1951 census, take a guess how many people defined themselves as Muslim Hindus? Zero. Zero, not even one. The category disappears. Now, but the purpose of Ben Anderson is that it is through this mapping process that identities are created. And it is the creation of an identity actually becomes, an artifact of the state. The state itself goes out to create this identity. And the interesting thing, of course, he talks about is that popular nationalism unifies and official nationalism divides. The purpose of official nationalism is to divide. It is to create this taxonomy in which people can exist. Popular nationalism includes and official nationalism excludes. And, they don't, there's a dialogical relationship, but nevertheless, they two sort of work closely together. So there is, the point that I'm making is that in developing countries, a lot of the nationalistic process took the form of official nationalism. Took the form of official nationalism. And it's very important to remember. It took the form of official nationalism which was imposed from above. That is how nation states got created. There are very few exceptions, like Korea and so forth, which are historically very, very well united and so forth. And that actually has a bearing on how people actually even think about the unification processes, processes that are in some sense imposed from above. The second thing is that the official nationalism, even though it was an artifact of the state, was very closely led by a kind of an elite group which sort of went beyond the state. In one of my lighter moments in Pakistan, I called this elite group the Paki Saxons. I mean, this is English-speaking people like me, English-speaking people who really, regardless of where their income level, I mean, have a tremendous access to power and privilege and so forth. Not because of their talent, but just because they happen to have some connection with this thing. Now, this group, in some sense, a kind of a vanguardist group, was very closely aligned with the agenda of the state to build the nation. And so this building of the collectivity, the role of the vanguard group, and its reaction, which has taken the form of a lot of identity politics, religious politics, ethnic politics, and so forth, which is in some sense a reaction against the nation state. All of these are anti-nation movements, is a fundamental thing about understanding this thing. Two other points about this thing are important. One is that the experience of the South about democracy is as a steam valve, as a way of bypassing the people rather than as a way of including the people. The colonial governments, when they introduced democracy in India, for instance, or in many of the other countries, actually took great pains to ensure that even though people would have some right, that they would be restricted to very sort of harmless areas. In India, the system was called diarchy, in which the imperial government, the viceregal government, had control of what they call the strategic areas: defense, foreign affairs, police, and finance. And education and health and welfare and so on and so forth. This was with the elected sort of people. And to this day, this division continues. Now they just come from Washington. The people who are finance ministers that have oftentimes spent stints in the World Bank and so on and so forth, or the IMF. Or even if not the finance minister, the person who sits over the finance minister and tells him what to do, oftentimes come from the IMF and so on. Whereas the other segments are viewed as populist entities, populist ministries, and so on and so forth, with which the purpose is to create patronage and so on. But the important thing is that democracy also has a kind of a very interesting sort of pedigree over here as a steam valve, and therefore people sort of approach it, although very ardently, but also with a certain degree of cynicism about this thing. And the other point about this experience is that developmentalism has very strong links with the earlier global processes, namely those of colonialism and imperialism. I mean, they're very strong relationship to both of them. I mean, colonialism and imperialism, in my mind, I follow a little bit of the debate that took place around J. Hobson's writing. Colonialism was very much the corporations, the East India Company, for instance, having a free play, going out, colonizing lands, using them. And imperialism was when the state actually came in and created an empire. In India, that took place somewhere around the middle of the 19th century, 1857, the so-called Indian Mutiny and so on. But there you'll find a tremendous change in the relationship between the imperial state around that time, changing from a kind of an exploitative form of colonialism to a more good governance type of colonialism. And in some sense, what we are seeing today also is that there is a fear not only of the return of colonialism, but a return of the earlier form of colonialism, which was much more aggressive and much more destructive. Now, I want to now conclude. This actually has led to a lot of, the forming of the nation state, the forming of the nation, the forming of the collectivity has taken actually the form of resistance far more than of, a kind of an open process. It's not the printing press. It is through the resistance movements that this identity is being forged. It is through the resistance movements that it is being forced. There's a writer recently writing about D.H. Lawrence, in which he makes an interesting point. He was talking about Italy. It could have been about Pakistan. And he said it's really, because everybody is so against the nation state, that he says Italy is unified by the hatred of the Italian government. It's this hatred of the government. It's the government destroying itself in order to make the nation come alive. And it's this kind of a resistance. And everything. When I was listening to David Ozonoff today, I was thinking about, all the open protests that took place against the smallpox eradication drive in India. Huge protests. And similarly, the protest against the population policy. I was listening to Dr. Haga and so on and so forth. It's almost that it has led to a kind of a guerrilla democracy, not an illiberal democracy, as Fareed Zakaria would say, but a guerrilla democracy in which NGOs and sort of ad hoc groups are actually coming together to bring some of these things together. Anyway, what I want to do is, sorry, I sort of, when Adil told me 20 minutes, I said, look, I'm from Pakistan. I can't even say hello in 20 minutes. What do you want me to do? So let me just take 2 minutes, Chairman, and I'll promise you I'll conclude. Now, what I want to do is to say, look, there is a southern sensibility out there. When we think of, creating this when we think of engaging in this formation of the planetary phase of civilization, not only do we need to, as those who are part of the global elite in the sense that I was using the Paki-Saxons, not only do we need to engage with this sensibility, in some sense, to make it, internal to us, but in some sense to understand that it is through that sensibility that the global identity will emerge, because the conditions of the emergence of the global identity are almost identical to the conditions that existed in many of the developing countries. And I don't have time, maybe the question and answer, I'll come back to some of these issues if people were. There is, in this sensibility, there's a tremendous fear of the recurrence of colonialism. There's a fear that history will remember the second half of the 20th century as simply a short interlude in the long march of colonial rule. This was, just that, one bright period. There's tremendous fear. This actually influences a lot of our multilateral environmental agreements, which is the other hat that I wear. I mean, in 1960, if you read the anti-colonial resolution passed by the United Nations General Assembly, in which, colonialism was, branded as almost as something evil, and 2 years later, almost as a result of the anti-colonial resolution, they passed the Treaty on the Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Wealth, which said, no other country shall have sovereignty over the wealth that exists in my country. The nation shall have permanent sovereignty over natural wealth. And, it was the same sensibility that its colonialism was driven by the need to control natural resources. When we get into all the global environmental issues, we find that this sensibility and this fear, in some sense, is sitting out there. It's not something that we recognize. Anyway, but so when we think about this, in the South, there is almost that there is a lack of confidence in the state because of experience with official nationalism. There's also, in many countries, a lack of confidence in the market. And so the market reform and the policy reform scenario, desirable as they might be, feasible as they might be, have questions of legitimacy hanging over them. And those questions are things that we need to take seriously. When I was a young man, I remember reading in the Barricades of Spring in 1968 that they had put the banner over the Sorbonne which said, God is dead, Marx is dead, and I'm not feeling too well either. The state is dead, and the market is dead, and I'm not feeling too well either. I'm just almost done. So I mean, the thing is that we therefore, when I look at the experience of this identity creation and the collectivity in third world from the South, civil society has actually played a very central role in all of this. And civil society, almost in what I call the guerrilla democracy, sort of thing, building of social capital, placing the building of social capital at the center, providing service, providing rights and advocacy and so on and so forth, building legitimacy, building trust, and so on, and placing the concerns of the poor and the disenfranchised at the center. In some sense, if one thinks about a developing country and asks, who are the people who are really concerned about issues of justice, about what we are as a people, the kind of concerns that Thomas Paine, for instance, was writing at the birth of this country. Who are the people? You actually find that there is a kind of a civil society movement which articulates those concerns and represents them collectively. Now, if we follow that logic, then at the collective level, it is that kind of a sensibility which needs to bring about the planetary phase of civilization. And that sensibility, whether it belongs in the non-government organizations or not, which I don't think it does, but it is that sensibility which many of us call civil society. It is that sensibility of creating social capital, placing justice at the center, and being responsible for the concerns and the needs of the poor people who have been excluded from economic and political resources. It's placing that at the center. Being concerned about the issues of migration, for instance, which is not really, a sort of a burning issue from that perspective over here. Being concerned about issues of dignity and so on and so forth. It's that, those are the things that are at the center. 2,000 years ago, This is one of my favorite quotes. Heraclitus, the philosopher, he said something very interesting. He said, there's only one struggle in the world, and that is justice. Justice is the strife. Now, 2,000 years ago, later, in this era of globalization, that insight is still true today. Planetary society cannot be built unless there's a planetary group which is committed to justice at the center. There is only one struggle in the world, and that is justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tariq. It was worth every minute. Let's take perhaps 3 or 4 questions for our 2 speakers here, and then we'll let them have at the questions. Yes. We need a microphone, please. Thank you.
I might have 2. One is, I wonder if you could talk to the role of knowledge as a public good and how that can be shared globally. And the 2 of you, I think, might put heads together in those terms. And the second is it possible that we sitting in this room are part of the official national globalism as opposed to the popular?
Other questions? I saw another hand up. Paul, can we get the microphone up here? Thank you.
I really shouldn't do this because I have the privilege of debating these issues with Tariq almost every day. But Tariq, if the world is a third world country, it's a third world country that's an island. It's totally autarkic. It has no foreign policy and no experience with colonialism. So I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about how it's not a third world country, or if it is, if we look to the historic nationalism as a metaphor, an experience, an antecedent for globalism, then which lessons should we learn? Is it Italy, where the nations now are like city-states in Italy, where it took a really strong central push to overcome that centripetal force, possibly the seeds of later of fascism? Or is there, on the other hand, signs of hope? I mean, Italy didn't have a problem with its climate, with destroying its climate system. And at the same time, other third world countries where there was the opportunity for elites to ally exogenously with other elites, that's not the case here. So there may be actually lessons to be learned about how it's not like a third world country, and might be sources of opportunity to think how governance could emerge at this level in ways that aren't constrained by some of the experiences that we've had in third world countries.
Maybe one more question before we open it up. Yeah, back here. Raise your hand again so she can see you. Thank you.
This is a comment, Pedro, for you. I was reminded in your presentation on global public goods how similar the open source software movement is in many ways to the criteria that you laid out for global public goods intentionally being in the public domain. And I was wondering if there are sort of philosophical overlaps there that might be worth exploring. So I'll just sort of leave it at that.
Pedro, do you want to start response to that question?
Maybe I could start with a few comments about knowledge as a global public good. In fact, in the Blue Book that we published in 1999, Joe Stiglitz wrote a chapter on knowledge as a global public good. And essentially the point he makes is that knowledge is the quintessential global public good in many instances. Knowledge is inherently non-rival, and it's very often difficult to exclude others once an invention comes up or a scientific discovery comes up, or we know something about anything at all, to exclude others from knowing it as well. In concrete terms, when we look at how to enhance the provision of knowledge, if you'd like, as a global public good, we look at 2 issues. One is the issue of access to knowledge that is already available. Because even though access to it at an intellectual level is possible, access to the technologies or the tools that lead to utility being derived from this knowledge existing is imperfect. One example is the health area, if you want. We know of many interventions that are available to control communicable diseases that work in rich countries and are not deployed in developing countries. I could give many examples, but a particularly striking one is the case of vaccines for measles. Almost 1 million people, children, die every year of measles. Measles is a disease that in the Western Hemisphere doesn't exist anymore. The Pan American Health Organization has just announced it. It's not. I use this example because here it's not the case of a patent impeding the access to knowledge, as is the case for antiretrovirals, for example, still in the health area. It's really, we haven't found an ability to provide access to some of the knowledge that exists out there, and that could be shared very widely to the benefit of all. So that's one issue. The other issue is generating new knowledge that is not available at present to address problems, challenges that are specific to developing countries. And again, using examples from the health area, we could think about a vaccine against malaria. 3 million people die of malaria every year, approximately. Technically, technologically, it seems as though it would be possible to come up with a vaccine, but the incentives, market incentives, are not there, and governments are also not interested, apparently, in helping it. So this provides an example of the challenges that we face when we think about providing global public goods in general. It's really not a matter of relying on the market or on governments. We really need to find ways to bring all these actors together and find the incentive structures to be able to make them all work together in order to provide these global public goods. Open source software, yes, definitely. It is a quintessential global public good as well, also in the sense that it is produced in a very public way, in a very deliberately public way. And in fact, we are now starting to analyze in our office the several dimensions of open source software as a global public good.
I just want to make there are three questions. One is on knowledge and creation of global public goods. The other one is, are we official nationalism? And the third one, Paul's challenge to think about positive examples. You see, I have a slightly, let's say, more ambivalent view about knowledge. Not because, I mean, obviously one doesn't mean that, ignorance is good and knowledge is bad, but, this problems of access, which Pedro sort of, or Miguel sort of, that this problem of access are far more significant than I think we give them credit for. 2 points. Take my country, Pakistan. There are approximately 18 million people, 18 million young men and women between the ages of 17 and 23 of college-going age. Of them, the people enrolled in colleges or universities, it'll blow your mind, 475,000. The other 17.5 million plus don't have that access. They're excluded literally from this thing. And the 475,000 of them, maybe a good 100,000 actually get a decent education. The other 375 is just a makeshift education. They don't have the skills or the capacity and so on. Now, in some sense, this is an institutional and infrastructural obstacle to bringing people into kind of a knowledge world, and therefore creating a public good which sort of bridges across people. In fact, it is creating much more what is being called a digital divide. It's much more an intellectual and a conceptual divide, of a very fundamental nature. But it doesn't only stop there. I mean, it also sort of says that, I have actually looked at some of the issues on the production of knowledge, which can be, which is not necessarily viewed only as a neutral activity. It is also a political activity, because the production of knowledge to justify the kind of things that states have been doing and the kind of things which, people, basically with very narrow parochial interests at heart have been doing to justify those kind of things. Those kind of knowledges are much more easily distributed. Even today, the kind of stereotyping and so forth, which is all part of the knowledge production that the cultural reproduction that the global society engages in, is extremely problematic. So I think that it is what one can say is that their knowledge does have the potential of becoming not only a public good, but actually contributing to the creation of this planetary civilization. But the fundamental problems are such that unless they are addressed, it can actually be counterproductive. That it is actually creating divisions, excluding people, and creating all sorts of resistance against what is being proposed. And therefore, it is absolutely imperative that investment need be done in these areas and bringing them to power. Now, of course, this is it will take us much farther afield to get into this area, but at a very summary level, that's that's my view on this. Now, the thing that you said about official nationalism, are we part of official nationalism? I think one of my main concerns is that we have the possibility not to be, but we are in very real danger of being a part of an official nationalism process. Unless we are actually concerned about some of these issues, about these issues of inclusion and about actually issues of, speaking on, on behalf of the rights of literally of others. Unless we are sort of prepared to do this, this kind of a top-down globalization will continue and will become even more problem. And this probably is also a reference to, I think, what was behind Paul's question in terms of searching for good examples. The reason why I gave an example of the third world, one of the reasons is that I think it is that the people who are in some sense at the sort of the leadership position, people who feel that they are responsible for building a nation, for building this national community and so forth, have actually not really been concerned about the issues that I was talking to you about today, about justice, about fairness, about equity, about normative concerns of a variety of problems. What are we as a people? They've not really been that concerned about it. They've been concerned far more with what can be called performative concerns. How do we, how much control do we have over nature? How much control do we have over these processes? It's really those kind of, it's either GNP or it is control over nature or control over energy or, our power relative to the power of other countries. Are we a powerful society? We are going to make you a powerful society and so forth. Homi Bhabha at Harvard actually has a very good paper on nationalism in which he contrasts the discourses of nationalism with the discourses of globalism. And he says, look, the interesting thing is that discourses of nationalism throughout have this creative tension between normative concerns and performative concerns. Normative in the sense of we as a people believe in these kind of things and uphold some core values and so on. And performative concerns, look, we are a nation because we are strong and we will succeed and we will overcome and we will confront, and so on and so forth. And I hear a lot of this in the nationalist discourse in my country. Now, having said that, and Paul asked me to give a positive example. There are lots of examples which one can take from the national experience of nationalism in order to understand both the promise and the peril of globalism. One of the things is that, you see, the importance that Ben Anderson, for instance, gives to popular nationalism. He actually talks about certain conditions. And so this morning, I think you asked about, material conditions and so forth. Now, in a sense, he was saying the same kind of thing that Paul was saying. Conditions are ready. This sensibility has emerged. People want to be a part of a global community. And they want to be a part of global community at a very large scale, not the small scale that used to be earlier, because some conditions are ready. There is the internet, there is international travel, there is knowledge, the knowledge revolution, there is international business, and so on and so forth. Now, those conditions are ready, and therefore, the glass is ready to be tapped. Number two, not only are those conditions to be ready, but what we find is that in those, the actions that actually led to inclusiveness were actions that were helpful. So actions that led to, sort of the enactment of the rights of people or protection of the rights of people, actions that led to creation, of more open, greater openness and greater sort of, what should I say, for want of a better word, a kind of a more of a level playing ground. That these are conditions that actually helped in this thing. The third thing is also something that happened at the national level is that, you see, a lot of the creation of this national identity, I called it resistance. But I think that, it was the broad social movements, whether you think of the labor movement, whether you think of the women's movement, whether you think of, the environmental movement in whatever form it was in the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries, about forests and so forth. These were all movements which not only protected the rights of certain people, but also helped define what that society was. And by defining that society and actually creating centrality to these issues of justice and responsibility, helped create that nation. Now, in some sense, we are trying to infuse that back into the discussion and creation of a social movement in which these issues would become central, so that we actually become responsible for a process that brings people together rather than divides them. That's the sorry, Paul. That's the response. I'm sorry, they are very telegraphic answers. I mean, I can't do anything better than this thing. Sorry.
Other questions? In the back? There.
You don't know this guy's name, right?
No, it's like stuck in the
No,
back door.
I just thought, since I'm quite likely to co-opt these ideas and try to pass them off as my own pretty soon, I'd better understand them right. My question is about the press and sort of this official nationalism. If in fact there is this sense of sort of transforming into either a planetary society in the popular nationalism or in the official nationalism version, I was wondering about the faith that Anderson has in the press. The press was also a fairly unjust invention in the sense that it did decimate a lot of local cultures. So while it harmonized a popular language, it did so at the cost of a lot of other languages. And I was wondering whether the analog to that today is the internet or whether it is CNN. And whether that makes a difference.
My feeling is this, that, when one, this is sort of doing the things at a very, very, very broad brush, sort of looking at huge processes. Now, obviously, once we go into details of any of these things, you take the printing press or, you take any of the other initiatives, the dictionary, to which he also gives a great deal of importance and so on. When you start exploring each one of them, it becomes extremely complex, and it really is very difficult to reach any kind of a judgment. What sort of works for my purposes is to use it A as a metaphor, and B to extract from it a kind of a lesson of how are we to position ourselves with regard to something that has happened. Maybe. If I completely jump into another field and give an analogy, maybe that would be helpful. I mean, I am, as you know, have been both a critic of and a great admirer of the Green Revolution, which would not have taken place without the kind of leadership and without the personal interaction and so on and so forth. But it wasn't only the dwarf wheat variety. I mean, it was actually the institutional and other structures that actually led to it. But one thing which actually has struck me very greatly is the fact that when I looked at a lot of the anti-poverty programs in South Asia, Comilla program in Bangladesh, and a number of the anti-poverty programs in rural areas, they always went in with the Green Revolution in their back pocket. They always went in telling the farmers, we are going to bring you some of these things. At the time when the government also had an extension program and, huge investment in the Green Revolution. Now, in some sense, what they were trying to do is to say, well, here is something that has happened. We will humanize it for you. We will bring it within your reach and enable you to enjoy them in ways in which the normal process would not have enabled you to enjoy them. Now, I mean, my own feeling is the popular globalization is what people call globalization. That is happening. The civilizational globalization is for us. That is the Akhtar Hamid Khan, who actually went in and said, this is something that has happened. I'm going to bring it to you. Now, for instance, when you say, here is knowledge that can potentially be within your reach, except there's a lot of fine print, and I'm very sorry. I mean, you can't get it because you don't speak the language, you don't have a computer, you don't have electricity, and blah, blah. You're not even in the game, forget it. But, it's potentially within your reach. Then it actually requires some people to go out and say, we will get it to you. And it is that kind of a thinking. But that also, I mean, it's not, I don't mean that, one person needs to do it. It's that kind of a thinking that needs to infuse our sensibility about the global project. And if we do it, we actually construct a different image in our heads about how it is going to unfold. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Any questions? I saw a hand up somewhere, I thought. Comments? Okay. Well, it just so happens that we're due for a break anyway, so thank you very much, Tariq and Pedro, again.